In this second video on the true Coase theorem, we're going to use an application. This actually comes from David Friedman's Law's Order, what he calls a spaghetti diagram. And what we're going to be doing is to see how transactions costs do matter and why the assignment of rights are important when judges make decisions. And we're going to use the examples of railroads and farmers. And railroads, again, their engines emit sparks which alight on fields and burn crops for the farmers. So let's take a look at applying this. So we're going to look at 4 scenarios and 3 outcomes. The outcomes are A, B, and C. And they're going to deal with fires. The sparks are emitted and wheat is on the farmers grow wheat and the sparks cause fires and the wheat to burn. The second is farmers switch from growing wheat to growing clover. Clover doesn't burn, there's no harm to the farmers. We still have sparks because the railroad is emitting sparks, but there's no harm to the farmers really because they've switched their crops to clover. The only harm is now the farmers don't get as much money for their crops, and then so they lose that. And the third outcome is a spark arrestor. The railroads will install a spark arrestor. You have no sparks, therefore no fires, and farmers can grow wheat without having to worry about the fire. So again, going over this, outcome A, the railroads emit sparks, the farmers grow wheat, the wheat burns. Outcome B, the railroads emit sparks, the sparks alight on clover, the farmers switch from growing wheat to clover, which they lose money because clover is not a cash crop for them, and therefore they lose that money. C, the railroads put spark arresters on their engines, and there is no harm to the farmers. They still grow wheat, but there are no fires. So we can take a look at 4 different scenarios. Scenario A is the cost of damage to the farmers from the fires is $400. The cost to farmers of switching to clover is $800, and the cost of a spark arrestor is $1,000. Obviously, the least cost way of dealing with the fires dealing with the sparks is the $400 worth of fire damage. Scenario B will be that the clover is the least cost means. That's only $400. The next highest would be allowing the wheat to burn. That would be $800. And again, the highest cost alternative is for a spark arrestor for the railroad engine. Scenario C would be the least cost means would be installing a spark arrestor. That's only $200. The switching to clover is $400, and allowing the fires to burn is $800. So we want to minimize the cost. Now I'm going to look at outcome D. That's going to come up at the end. We're going to worry about that in a little bit. That's not going to be the main point we're going to look at with the spaghetti diagram, but it does come up. And that will be the fires cost $600 worth of damage, clover costs $800, and installing a spark arrestor is $1,000. So when we look at the Coase theorem, what George Stigler was arguing was the following: if fires are the least cost means of the problem with sparks, then you assign the right to the railroad. The railroads emit sparks and cause damages. The farmers are going to watch the crops burn. Alternatively, they can switch to clover. That'll cost them $800, or they can try to buy a spark arrestor. That's $1,000. Neither of those are effective. They're just going to have their crops burn. Assign the rights to the farmers, and the railroad is going to pay the farmers anywhere from $400 to $800 in order to burn their crops, and the farmers are going to accept it because anything over $400 they're willing to do that. So again, you end up with the least cost outcome, which is the fires. Now, with the clover, assigning the right to the railroad, again, you're going to have the same thing. The railroad is going to emit sparks. It's going to cause $800 worth of damage. The farmers realize they can switch to clover, and therefore they get a lower cost. It's only going to lose $400 instead of $800, so they're going to do that. And they're not willing to spend the money for a spark arrestor because that's $1,000. You assign the rights to the farmers, and again, the railroad, instead of spending $1,000 for a spark arrestor, is going to pay the railroads anything from $400 to $1,000 to switch their crops over to clover, and just doesn't matter to whom you assign the right, you ended up with the same low-cost outcome. The third one is you assign the right to the railroad. The farmers are going to band together. Instead of losing $800 in crop damage or switching to clover at a cost of $400, they're going to pay the railroad $200 in order to install a spark arrestor. Assign the right to the farmers, and the railroad is not going to pay them $800 worth of damage or $400 to switch to clover. They're going to install the $200 spark arrestor. So again, it did not matter to whom you assigned the right, you got the same outcome. This is a common misinterpretation of what Coase is saying. Here you have William Shugart, Chappell, and Coates arguing in the absence of transactions costs, the allocation of resources independent of the initial assignment of property rights. That's not true. So let's look at a couple of the problems. Let's look at obstacle number 1, what we call a public goods problem. In this example, we have 100 farmers. There are 100 farmers. They're each suffering $4 worth of damage for a total of $400. So if the farmers can pay the railroad at least $400 for a spark arrestor, they can save themselves. So in this example here, let's say it's going to cost $400 for a spark arrestor. They're suffering $8 worth of crop loss from the fires. So if they can come up with $400, it's cheaper for them to do that than to lose the $800 worth of crop damage. So 100 farmers get together. 90 out of the 100 agree to pay, contribute $450 each for a total of $405. That means the 10 remaining farmers don't have to worry about it. Well, the incentive is for every farmer to be a free rider on this. It's a public goods problem, and they're not going to get people voluntarily engaging, so you end up with the $800 crop loss instead of a $400 spark arrestor. So that's obstacle number 1. Obstacle number 2 is a holdout problem. Suppose that the railroad pays the farmers a total of $400 or $4 each. It can avoid paying $1,000 for a spark arrestor. 99 out of the 100 farmers agree to it. Let's say the railroad pays them $450 each. That's a total of $445.50. The last farmer realizes that if he agrees to that, to accepting $450, the railroad's getting off with, $550 in benefit. So this farmer agrees, so I'll do this, but I need you to pay me $100. Obviously, if she's the only one, the railroad's going to accept it because they're better off losing $600 instead of losing, or $650 instead of losing $1,000. But she's not the only one. A bunch of other farmers start doing it, and now you end up with having to have a $1,000 spark arrestor instead of $400 payment to the farmers for crop damage. So that's obstacle number 2 we call the holdout problem. Obstacle number 3 are negotiation costs. Here I've been assuming that all farmers suffered identical harm. But what if each farmer had a different loss totaling to $400? Some farmers lost maybe $1 worth of crops. Another farmer lost $6. Now if you're going to have some sort of a lawsuit or any type of payment, now the railroad has to negotiate how much is really being lost. In a world of zero information problems, it's easy. We already know what it is. But in the real world, you have these negotiation costs which can exhaust any gains from trade, and you end up with the least cost solution. Obstacle number 4 is court costs and error. Under a liability rule, A can harm B, but must compensate B for the harm. Okay, so if I can, driving down the road, I may hurt you, but I have to pay for your damages if it's a negligence on my part. And in this case here, it leads to a lawsuit, which the lawsuits themselves are costly, and B, we're assuming that judges are omniscient and they don't make mistakes. There can often be mistakes. Judges could either assign the right to the wrong person or make a mistake in terms of the value of the damage or the loss to the farmers, and therefore you end up with court error, court costs, and court error. So with these, we're going to see that there are 4 different rules that judges can do. One is a property right by the railroad. When we say somebody has a property right, it means you have to get their permission to do something. I have a property right in my car. In order for you to use my car, you have to get my permission, or you might have to buy it from me. But that's a property right to me. So in this case here, it's a property right by the railroad. The only way the farmers can stop the railroad from emitting sparks is to get the railroad's permission to do it. Or to stop the railroad from coming through, the railroad has a right to go through the tracks on their land. They have to get the railroad's permission in order to stop that. A property right to the farmer. The railroad has to get the acquiescence or the agreement from the farmers that it can emit sparks that burn the crops. So that would be a property right by the farmers. In this case here, the farmers decide what they want to do, but the railroad bears the cost. Number 3, a liability rule by the farmers, or liability right. A liability right says you can do something, but you have to compensate anybody who is hurt by that action. So a liability right by the farmers means the railroad can go through and emit sparks, but it has to compensate the farmers for any damage. So the railroad decides, and the railroad bears the cost. The other one is a liability right by the railroad. In this case here, the farmers can decide what they want to do, but they have to pay any damage to the railroad. So we have a property right by the railroad. The railroad can decide what it wants to do, and the farmers have to bear the costs. A property right by the farmers decide what they want to do, but the railroad bears the cost. A liability rule by the farmers, the railroad can go through, but the railroad has to bear the cost of its actions. Or a liability right by the railroad, the farmers decide what they want to do, but they have to compensate the railroad for any damage to the railroad. So we'll be using these 4 different rules to understand when transactions costs impede something. So we'll start with the different outcomes. A was the railroad emits sparks, the farmers grow wheat, part of the wheat is destroyed by the fire. B would be sparks, the railroad still emits sparks, the farmers switch from growing wheat to growing clover. There's a cost to the farmers, but you end up with no fires. And C would be there was a spark arrestor is installed on the railroad, on the engine, and therefore there are no sparks. And so therefore the farmers still grow wheat, there are no fires. And the last one is no sparks and clover and no fires. That doesn't make sense to do both. If you're going to put a spark arrestor, the farmers don't need to switch over to clover, so that's an irrelevant outcome anyway. Now, let's look at a property right by the railroad. And again, a property right by the railroad says the railroad can do something, and the only way the farmers can stop it is to get the permission of the railroad. So the railroad is going to emit sparks. In that case there, if that's the least cost means, in this case here, the sparks cost $400 worth of damage to the wheat. Switching to clover was $800. Installing a spark arrestor was $1,000. We want the fires to happen. And if you assign a property right by the railroad, that is going to happen because the railroad's simply going to emit sparks. The farmers are not going to find it in their interest to do anything but grow wheat. We end up with the least cost outcome. Number 2, switching to clover. Assign a property right by the railroad will go through and emit sparks. The farmers do not want to spend $1,000 for a spark arrestor when they can simply spend $400 switching their crops over to clover. They will take that action. So both of these are outcomes that would happen with a property right by the railroad. This would not be the case though. Now if you have no sparks, if the least cost means is a $200 spark arrestor, that would be the least cost means. Assigning a property right to the railroad would be problematic because, again, now you have the public goods problem. The farmers will try to come together to raise $200 to buy the spark arrestor. That would be $2 per farmer, but now you're going to have farmers who don't contribute because it's a public goods problem, and in the end you end up with $1,000 or actually $800 worth of crop damage instead of a $200 spark arrestor. So a property right by the railroad will not work when it comes to having to come together and compensate the railroad for a spark arrestor. Now let's look at a property right by the farmers. If the least cost means of damage would be either wheat burning or the farmers switching to clover, a property right by the farmers wouldn't work because the railroad has to come together and compensate the farmers and get their permission. And what you're going to have is you're going to have some holdout problems. And again, if the cost of the wheat is $400, a spark arrestor is $1,000, so the damage to the wheat is $400, the spark arrestor is $1,000. In order to go through the farmers' fields and emit sparks, the railroad has to get permission from the farmers. Well, it's going to try to bargain with the farmers by giving them $4 or $4.50 a piece to cover their damage, but you're going to have some that are going to hold out and say, no, I want $100 for mine, and you end up with the railroad having to keep the spark arrestor for $1,000 instead of the farmers struggling with either a $400 wheat damage or switching over to clover for $400. So the property right by the farmers does not work in this situation. A property right by the farmers would work here because the railroad would simply switch over to a spark arrestor, which costs $200, as opposed to paying the farmers either $800 or $1,000. So under this circumstance, the property right by the farmers would only work with when the railroad is the least cost avoider of the problem. Now let's look at the liability right by the farmers. And again, in this case here, the railroad can emit sparks, but it has to compensate the farmers for the damage. So in this case here, if wheat is the least cost measure, that's only $400 loss to the farmers, the railroad still has to compensate them, and that goes to court because it's a negligence or it's a liability right. The railroad comes through, emits sparks, the farmers sue in order to be compensated. Now you have litigation costs and court error. There's a cost of going to court. The judge may make a mistake in terms of the value of the loss, may even assign to the wrong person, and so that's one of the bad outcomes of a liability right to the farmer when the least cost measure is simply wheat burning. Second one would be sparks, and again, here you have negotiation costs. In order to get the farmers to switch over from wheat to clover, if the railroad goes through, it either has to compensate the loss of wheat or try to convince the farmers to switch over to clover, which in this case here would be the cheapest alternative, but now you have negotiation costs. And oftentimes it's going to be harder for farmers to agree to how much it's going to cost them. A liability right by the farmers, when the least cost means of abating the problem is simply a $200 spark arrestor, the railroad will simply install the spark arrestor and the problem is averted. And the last one, we're going to look at a liability right by the railroad. And again, in this case here, the farmers can enjoin the railroad from doing something or can stop the railroad, but they have to compensate them for damages. In this case here, when wheat burning is the least cost measure, the farmers are simply going to accept the wheat being burned for $400 as opposed to switching to clover for $800 or buying a spark arrestor for $1,000. Same thing with clover. If switching to clover is the least cost measure, the farmers will simply switch their crops to clover. That's easy, sure to say cheaper. But when the spark arrestor is the least cost means, the railroad's not going to do it voluntarily, so again you have a public goods problem. If the farmers want to stop the damage, they have to come together and pay to have the spark arrestor installed. You're going to have a public goods problem because some farmers are not going to want to contribute. So instead of having the $200 spark arrestor, you're going to have $800 worth of either crop damage or switching to clover. So again, transactions costs matter, and therefore it should determine the assignment of rights. Again, this is a little confusing, but understanding how this comes together and why the assignment of property rights is very important. Now, one last thing. We talked about that last scenario where the crop damage was $600, switching to clover was $800, and a spark arrestor was $1,000. This Friedman uses to explain why Pigouvian tax does not necessarily lead to an efficient outcome. With a Pigouvian tax, if the railroad is causing $600 worth of harm to the farmers, then it has to pay a $600 tax, according to Pigou. The externality damage is $600, impose a tax on the railroad of $600. So the railroad pays a $600 tax. The farmers suffer $600 worth of crop damage. That's a total of $1,200. A spark arrestor is $1,000, right? So what happens is, as opposed to the railroad paying the $600 fine and the farmer suffering a $600 loss, a total of $1,200, the two get together, the farmers agree to pay the railroad $500, the railroad kicks in $500, and now it installs a spark arrestor for $1,000. That is a least cost means for these two under Pigouvian tax system, and this is one of the reasons why Coase was arguing Pigouvian tax doesn't necessarily lead to the most efficient outcome. Because in this case here, the most efficient outcome would be for the crop damage. However, when the $600 payment to the government by the railroad is taken into account and also added to the $600 worth of crop damage, the farmers and the railroads can come together and for $1,000 solve the problem cheaper, and now you end up with a $1,000 spark arrestor, which is the least efficient solution that's being realized. That's the end of the real Coase theorem.